Do you want to make things clear to people? Do you want people to remember? Because they will never remember just a list of facts. They just won't. They will always remember a great story, and even more so, they'll remember the feeling you brought to them when you told that great story.
This is Brent Richardson, and welcome to the Business Minutia Podcast, where our focus is on the details of business that are often passed over by traditional classes and leadership training. We focus on the stories of real people who have tried, failed, and learned through their experiences and are willing to share their lessons with others.
Brent, in my life, the idea of stories was normally written. I was introduced to fables, short stories, novels, that kind of thing. But your upbringing was a little bit different. How did storytelling play out in your life?
Well, storytelling was part of the time that I spent with my dad. And bedtime stories are kind of a traditional thing for a lot of people. Mine was a little bit different than the traditional in the sense that my dad often worked he was up early in the morning working construction. So he was in bed early. His bedtime was earlier than mine in many cases. And so we still would do bedtime stories. I would put him to bed. I would actually sit in there and listen to him tell me stories. And my dad was a Vietnam veteran, so the stories were incredible, and as a young man watching movies like Rambo, in my mind, that's who my dad was, right? So he would give me the choice between, a bedtime story about a squirrel lost in the woods, something you'd see out of a cartoon book, or Vietnam. I take Vietnam every time, right? So the stories of my dad, the hero, were the ones that I loved.
And we've brought that into the upbringing of our own children. We've always told them bedtime stories, whether we were reading a book or telling them stories from our own lives. We've even done games with them, like what's the next sentence in the story, and make up our own story around the dining room table.
Absolutely. And I remember, we were talking the other night about how a story we remembered, and we couldn't even remember what the metaphor was or what the point of the story was being told for, but we remembered the story. So stories have a powerful ability to lock and kind of be anchor points in our minds. And that's kind of one of the things that Shawn gets into that we talk about this week, because, we talked about the value of storytelling in general, but we didn't get into a lot of details about how to do it. And that was the point of this episode.
Yeah, and Shawn was my first example of a great oral storyteller. He is absolutely fantastic. Listening to him around a campfire, it is just a treat. And Shawn is actually the CEO of a nonprofit that we work for, Wonder Voyage. But beyond that, the man is a professional storyteller. And this episode is all about breaking down what makes a great story.
And how you can be one as well, right? I don't know that people were just born into being natural storytellers, and we get into that.
Shawn's argument is that everyone is a storyteller.
That's right. And he gets into how and what can you do to get better in that area. And we get some really good pointers in here that I loved.
Yeah, and it's more than just like telling a story about your childhood. He breaks it down into what this looks like in corporate America, how you can bring story into your presentations.
Yep. Enjoy, folks.
Yeah, it's funny when you say, what's the definition of a story? Because you think everybody knows what that is. But what we're really talking about could be something that is encapsulated in 30 seconds, or it could take an hour. For all intents and purposes, for businesses, we're talking shorter the better, usually. And we're talking about a narrative that is compelling, that makes the person who's listening to it feel like they are part of that narrative, part of that story. So you're compelling one way or another. You're either compelling someone inspirationally. It may be even compelling in a way that's dealing with behavior that's doing damage to a company. But in some way, you as the storyteller want to compel the hearer in a direction of some kind. That's what we're talking about.
Okay. So what are the parts of a story that are really, it seems like breaking down how a story should be or could be, or like the ideal story, and then translating that back over into how you would do this in a business proposal or where you're trying to compel somebody makes sense.
Yeah, it's the parts of a story are very basic, and everybody sometime in their junior high or high school or probably elementary school went through these. We don't really think about them too much when we are naturally telling stories. And we should say that there are certain people that are just natural storytellers. They have the gift of gab, and they can keep people moving. You have people who are introverts who don't want to talk. They don't feel good about getting up in front of people. But in essence, every single person is a storyteller. So everybody in your company, you as either an owner of a company or those who are employed, they have the ability in some way to tell the story or to embrace the story. The story is really simple. It's you obviously have a protagonist in the sense of the person that the story is about. You have the narrative that runs getting the person from point A to point B. Every single story, every good story has a conflict. There is something within the story that is trying to keep the protagonist back from getting to their goal. And then at the end, you have the resolution. You have the end. How did they get through? And really what we're talking about here, and we'll get to this in the sense of how this deals with companies, but the protagonist has to change from point A to point B, to the end of the story. That protagonist has to have had some sort of change. Minor, major, good, bad, doesn't matter. If that protagonist is the same exact person at the end of the story as they were at the beginning, it is a terrible story.
Right.
And companies, obviously every bit of advertising that's out there, good advertising tells a story. I remember probably my favorite commercial ever came in the late 90s, maybe even the early 90s. I can't remember. You'll know this commercial, and there's almost no words. It's a dad and a little girl sitting out on the edge of a cliff. And you see them from the back, and you watch the sun go down. This commercial lasted 18 seconds. You watch the sun go down, and the little girl turns to the daddy and says, "Do it again, Daddy."
I do remember that, yeah.
I was a parent of young kids at the time. First time I saw that, man, I bawled. That commercial, I don't remember what that commercial was for, but I guarantee you I bought that product. I guarantee you that thing touched me in such a deep level. And the advertisers were smart in saying, hey, if you engage in our product, you enter this story, this is the kind of wonder you will experience. It's fantastic. Right.
And it seems like for marketing cases like that, their job is to kind of paint you as the protagonist in the story, at least in that case. You want to feel tied to it. When people are incorporating me into the story, now I'm compelled to buy maybe.
Well, I think you're hitting on like a major thing here, because a lot of time really great storytellers want to tell stories about themselves, but you're missing the point. It has to be about when you're telling a story to your employees, and if you're telling them how great of a boss you are,
right,
they don't care.
Right.
But you make them feel like they're the protagonist of the story, that whatever the story is about, it may be something very personal, but you're basically lifting them up. They're becoming the heroes of the story, or your clients become the heroes of the story. That's a vital part of storytelling. I think that's something everybody's got to center on, is when I'm telling a story, am I making the listener the protagonist? Is the listener the hero of this story? Even if the story is my own personal story, does it come back to that?
And it's interesting because from the perspective of a corporate job where you're having to present material and you've got some data and you want to go show some data, we don't think of that as storytelling in traditional sense. But in reality, that's what's happening. You're proposing or you're showing some data to ideally show a conflict. You're trying to show a problem that needs to be solved, and along with your proposed solution, right? So all of that kind of communication is still storytelling. It's very similar to me to the protagonist, the narrative, the conflict, the resolution. you are walking people through. The protagonist is, hopefully you're painting it as someone in the audience as the protagonist to solve the problem for you. You're bringing the conflict, you're showing how we're going to get from A to B, and then ideally showing a proposed resolution that they get to take part of in kind of this choose your own adventure story. It's funny you mentioned, I've seen plenty of cases where people don't do this well, and they paint themselves as either the protagonist in the story, or they just don't specify the conflict, or all of these, some of these pieces or elements are missing. And a lot of times we will joke about those as what I did this summer presentations, because they just look like somebody talking about, then I went here and then I went here. Okay, that's cool, thanks. Next, did you get this person off the stage? And that's the wrong way to do it. But I think if you can break this story up this way, maybe the next question that I would have for you, are there different types and scenarios? So for example, the presentation I was just describing might be a 30-minute presentation with PowerPoint and things like this that corporate folks are used to. But what about the 2-minute variety that you might get in the elevator? Is there a difference?
Well, let's step back a little bit so people don't get overwhelmed. Because I know you got your people right now who are like, oh, I want to tell a better story. And you have people right now saying, I don't want to tell any stories. Mm-hmm. Stories are simply anchor moments within whatever the material is you have to present. The example of having to maybe go through something that's very mundane, but you have to get through these points. It's something for your team that you have to get through. Starting with a good story, which you have a ton of these stories that you tell, but you hook people at the front end who say, that's great. I'm entertained. I'm going to give him my time here. And now they're just in. So these are anchor points, whether, again, that's a 30-second anchor point or whether that is a 10-minute anchor point. Those stories anchor either at the beginning or typically either at the beginning or the end of whatever you're trying to do. So what are those things? You have, like you said, presentations. That's a big one. Presentations may be a simple pitch to the boss, or maybe your team that's sitting there in front of you. You have, from a management perspective, inspirational moments. The dreaded weekly meeting that everyone's just checking in. Man, it's so much better when there is some sort of inspirational story that's along with that. You have advertising. A lot of times we have to figure out how we're pushing our product out to our clients. And again, that's massively different when you are trying to sell furniture or you're an engineer creating tech for a company, but it's still advertising. Those are kind of your three main ones that you have to work with. I think within an organization, I'm probably missing some here, but those are the three ones that we're talking about. So the question isn't, you don't have to do a story every time, but do you have a story that works really well within, again, do you need to hook people up front to stick with you? Or do you need to have an emotional anchor at the end that inspires people to continue on with whatever you're presenting? Those are the main things. You said something very important. Some of us are great just off the top of our heads, but those rarely work until about the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth time of telling it. What's better is if you actually get this idea and then put that down on paper. Just simply, who are the protagonists? Who's my audience? Who are the people I want to make the heroes of this story? What is my conflict? What is the major thing that is holding me or this company or this organization back from moving forward? And then what's going to get us to the other side? What's going to be the resolution? What does that hero that I'm talking about, what can they do that overcomes the conflict? So writing those simple things down, just those three things, and start working through your story that way. You had your episode with Brett on. Well, Brett with Integrity is it Integrity Garage
Doors.
Doors. You think this dude is selling garage doors, but people loved that episode because we're watching a story unfold. We have a protagonist. We have Brett, who for years was scared out of his mind to launch out and start his own business. So now we're hearing his story. You catch him on the day he's actually doing this. We're now completely bought in. He starts going through all his challenges, and then we're biting our nails. How's this guy going to make it? Like, what's going to happen here? Now we're all waiting for the resolution. I know you're getting people coming back saying, when are we going to hear what's happened with Brett? What's happened with his business? And I'm telling you, Brett's a friend of mine. He has a story that I won't reveal here, but he has a story that happened within the first 6 weeks of this business that to me was like, that would make anybody now want to open their own business and take the chance. These are they're simple. And I think there are people within your organization, people you trust, people that are going to listen to you, that you can sit down and kind of bat through these things with. Like, here's my conflict. What's my resolution? Here's a protagonist. Here's a story about when I was fishing when I was a kid. I'm trying to figure out how to use this story. And be brave enough to know some of the times those stories are going to fail, and that's okay. Man, I'm an author. I tell stories. I am forever rewriting to just get better and better and better at what I'm presenting.
I remember the first time I learned that comedians practice their material over and over and over. In my mind, there were just funny people and there were non-funny people. And the funny people got paid tons of money to get up and tell stories and tell jokes and the things. And then when I realized, these people have been working on these bits for a long time, then the veil comes back and you go, oh, all right, well, it's not quite, the Wizard of Oz is just this little guy, and then you realize that's no different from the stories that we tell. So I was, writing some notes as you're talking. I think practicing your stories is important. Finding places to practice your stories. I watch my kids tell stories now, and I listen and I go, you're not quite there, but you got something. You're going to have to keep working on it. And it takes years of just, sitting around campfires or having a drink with somebody and telling these stories. And over time, you see which ones people react to in different ways, and finding the right homes in terms of when they apply. That's really good. I think practicing is something that people should definitely do, and never knowing which of those stories is going to be one that they're going to lean on.
Yeah, typically, so we'll tell a time when you and I were out on a trip, and we were leading a group of students in Europe, and we were about to go to a castle. And you told me just this little story about your mom and how she used to take you to, maybe it's better if you tell a little bit of it real quick here.
Yeah, we would go to these auctions and just look for various things from estate sales. And there was a kind of a treasure chest that came through where the key was broken off. And so no one had any idea what was in it. And of course we couldn't afford to let it go. We had to pay, I think we paid maybe $100 for the thing just to figure out what was inside. But that was the crux of the story, is that we paid $100 to, I did track that chest down, Shawn. I found the person who has it. I'm going to try to find it and buy it from them.
Amazing. You told me the story about like you just told it there. And then I'm like, Brent, we're going to be in a castle where there are actual treasure chests. I need you to work over the next 24 hours on that story, right? Because that little story is so inspirational. And you're like, inspirational in what way? About exploring. Like there's a bigger metaphor there, right, about taking chances and exploring. You told that story. I got to watch you tell that story in front of a treasure chest in a castle to 15 kids whose jaws were on the ground, just in like, whoa. And they walked away inspired for something way bigger in their life. But the point is, you were just telling me a story kind of just off the top of your head. It's just this little memory you had.
Right.
And took somebody from the outside to go, that's not just a little memory.
Yeah.
That story that you have will work easily in the business world,
Yep.
In with your family, with your friends. It's just a natural, we all do this. We have this. And I think we have to kind of build an awareness with the people around us. Hey, help me when you hear a good story. Help me point that out. Help me figure out how to use that in a wider way. Listen, if you have 1 or 2 good stories a year that you can use in a business setting, you can drop the mic and walk away. You can feel great. People will remember that story over 99% of everything else.
Right. As opposed to the 5 bullets and the 9 slides and the lecture material you had the rest of the time. The story is the thing. And it's a good example too, Shawn, to your point, is that everybody has these stories and we don't realize that we have them. That story was not something that I would have ever used in a setting like that, because you just don't see it. It just looks like, stuff that happened when you were 8. But those are the things that if you can practice them and figure out where they connect and how to go tie them in. One of the things that you also mentioned there, when we talked about conflict, one of the things that I notice in the corporate world is people that do presentations or give, even if it's just an elevator pitch that they're, happening to be in the hallway with a senior leader, and they struggle to get to the conflict. So do you feel like there's value in, certainly I feel like it is in the corporate world. I don't know if it's in other places, but getting to conflict as fast as you can. And the way we will say it is you need to capture the problem statement. You need to capture the problem that we're trying to solve succinctly and as quickly as you can.
Well, there's an axiom in storytelling. The amount of time it takes to tell a story is the amount of time it takes to tell a story. Whether that conflict, that you can watch any of your favorite movies, and that conflict may happen in the first 2 minutes, or it may not happen until, basically 2/3 of the way through. That's kind of the classic. But it's not a matter of when you get to the conflict. It's a matter of, is it really, like, have you made it something significant? Is it a real conflict? For us as an organization right now, as a travel company who got shut down completely because of COVID, that's a conflict that's like in everybody's head. So a lot of organizations are basically just rolling over, where in fact we're like, let's slay the dragon. Let's figure out, let's make this the thing we aim at as we ask people, when are you going to be ready to come back out again? So I think it doesn't matter about how fast you get to the conflict, but I know that the more, I'll use the term, the more minutia that you throw in there that is not important will muddy down your conflict. Yeah. So it's about keeping the story crisp and clear and clean. And we have a good buddy, Jason, who I actually find is a great storyteller, but he probably puts in about 50% more than he needs to in a story. And I always think I love listening to his stories, but I'm almost like, can we cut this down about halfway? Because you got gold here, but it's kind of like you're washing it down here. So that's important. I think part of that process of that storytelling and working with somebody is really editing out anything that does not move the story forward, that does not move the protagonist forward, that does. So back to your point, get to the conflict as quickly as it takes you to knock everything out of the story that's not important.
Sure. And
stick to what's important. And however long that takes is how long you take it. I do have a thought, a pretty important thought is, I think if you really want to develop this, you should, keep a notebook or notes on your phone, because stories pop into our minds all the time. We're triggered. We watch something on TV, we're in a conversation with somebody, we're sitting in a meeting, something will trigger a memory. It may be whatever that memory is a significant story. So you need to, at least in that moment, just stop for a second and put the notes down, hunting with grandpa in when I was 8, or Christmas presents, most exciting Christmas present ever, or my first paper route, or whatever it is that triggers. Write that down so you can go back and then glean through. I mean, I have lists upon lists upon lists upon lists of these. Like, it would drive you insane if you saw how big my memory list is. But when I go through and I'm ready to tell a story, I go through all of those lists to hone in on something that actually might really bring home the point of the story I want to tell. It may really bring home what I need. If I don't have that resource, just me trying to sit at my desk, trying to magic up like a memory, because I've got this meeting on the distribution of paper towels, what is that? You're just not going to come up with it. You got to have that list ready to glean over.
Right. It's a good point. I think starting to log and build your own kind of library of stories to lean on is a good idea, to be capturing and getting those down. I think, to your point earlier, I think for me, I just go to what's on my mind at the time. But I think it's important to make sure listeners, at least for me, I don't take a story and apply it, and it goes the other direction. I have a point or a proposal or a problem statement I'm trying to illustrate to people. I'm trying to help people understand a conflict and pull them in and make them the protagonist when I'm presenting. So that's how I incorporate the story into what I'm doing. And then I'm bringing some sort of outside story if it makes sense and applies and helps people see the conflict better. It doesn't go the other direction. I don't come in with a story and go, okay, I'm going to try to find a way to fit this into the paper towel pitch here. That never works for me. Is that the case for you?
It is for me, because I'm more of a kind of a natural storyteller, the way you are. But that is not the case for most people. Most people really do need to think through these things. Though, again, if I go do a speaking event or storytelling event, I have these developed stories that I've used. But again, I go back to that list often and find things. I'm in the middle of writing a book right now that I am finding stuff off that little list I've made over the last 20 years that I never thought I'd tell a story about that squirrel, and suddenly that memory kind of comes back and it becomes central. So it's a mixture. It depends on personalities. Very few people are just inspirational, kind of off the top of their head storytellers that way. Most of the time they need to kind of think through their material. Or again, oftentimes we use these stories casually, and we've got to be aware when they've captivated people. When for me, when I was a kid, we would go over once a year to my grandparents, or my grandparents would come in, and my grandfather, old Greek dude, who told the best stories. And we waited at the dinner table for him to just break out. And for 2, 3, 4 hours, sometimes he would tell stories. 80% of them I had heard before, but I wanted to hear them again. Yeah. And then he'd crack out a new story, something that triggered his memory. I think that was my earliest time, probably 9, 10 years old, of going, wow, this whole room is just here to hear him and to hear these stories that just enraptured us. I think, for the everyday person, you do this more than you ever know. You come home from work typically, and whoever's waiting for you is like, how was your day? Guess what? That's a story. Yeah. When you're talking to your friends on the phone, when you're catching up with family, whatever you're doing, people want to hear the stories of what you're doing. And there are times, no matter what your personality is, that you're doing a really good job of telling a story. Those are the things you've got to write down. Those are the things you've got to remember. Those are kind of those natural things that came to you that way, that can be resurrected in a way that may really work in the business setting.
You had mentioned earlier, presentations, inspirational type settings, and then advertising as three kind of big high level types of stories that you might leverage, or different types of presentations or places where you would need to bring a story in. Do you have any one style versus another, any kind of patterns that you formalized for yourself over the years for those?
Well, of course, whoever is the storyteller will kind of create their own way that they do it, and that's because everyone's story is so unique, and it's going to be unique on the teller. So every person has a unique way of storytelling. Think about, Brent, you and I both love comedians. You've got your storytelling comedians like Mike Birbiglia that will literally take 40 minutes to get to the point. And then you've got like these really, who was the guy years ago, the really dry story, the dry comedian? He was like monotone. I can't remember his name.
Not Skelton.
No, this is back in the 90s. But this guy would just tell a joke, monotone. It would last all of 7 seconds, but then the laughter would last about 30 seconds. He's telling a story the same way. You've got to be comfortable in your skin and know that who you are is really the best way to present a story. I think that's the hard part. When I see good storytellers, I'm like, God, I'll never be that good. And that's the wrong way. It's a human way to look at it, but it's not reality. The reality is people like you. They want to hear you. They want something. So if you're just a ball of energy, your story is probably going to be lightning. And if you're more laid back, you're going to have more of that country wisdom or something like that. Who knows? But be comfortable with just being who you are. So yes, I have my own style. You have your own style, but everyone is so different. And that's the beauty of that kind of storytelling.
Yeah, it's got to be authentic for you. Otherwise, it's going to fall apart.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you have to own it for sure. Any other words of wisdom for people who are maybe not ball of energy type of folks, not heavy? The challenge I always have is trying to get somebody to engage in storytelling or think in terms of telling story when they really aren't super charismatic. And I still see plenty of cases of people who aren't very charismatic, but still wind up being really good storytellers once they kind of figure out what their own skin looks like and, understand what their style is.
There's, the thing about like what you do and what really good storytelling managers do is they mentor their people in that. They let their people experiment and they walk their people through it. Unfortunately, it just doesn't happen in the business world too often. We're so, let's just get to the point and, ABC, that we lose the power of what it means to inspire people and to compel people with stories. So it takes almost finding someone. If you're okay, anybody can tell stories, but there are people that are listening to us right now that really want to do it way better. One of my suggestions is a podcast, The Moth podcast, is everyday people telling stories without notes from a stage, and start listening to a podcast storytelling kind of, thing like The Moth to really understand that everybody has a story to tell. And that's probably the best one out there that just kind of catches all different people from all different points of life. And when they go on stage, they're literally not allowed to have notes. They have to tell from the top of their head, from their heart. But they have worked really hard on that story. They have sat down with their friends, their family, and gone over the story over and over and over again before they get up there. That's how you're going to tell better stories. Is, again, like anything else, lots of practice, writing it down, keeping that notebook, and then being mentored by someone else. And if you don't have someone to mentor you, listen to something like The Moth. The Moth actually has great great tools that you can utilize off their website to learn to be a better storyteller. I also have a couple other books. Storyworthy by Matthew Dix. Storyworthy by Matthew Dix is he's a teacher who has actually been on the Moth a ton, but this is a very basic book on how to tell stories, how to be a better storyteller with what you have here. It's just got some great material that will help you, whatever level you're at, walk through and get a little bit better at where you're at right now. That's one that I think is fantastic. A book that came out a couple of years ago called The Power of Moments by Chip and Dan Heath. These brothers that put this together, The Power of Moments. It's a bit more academic. It's more for your people who love data and they love charts. But it talked about that it's these little stories that companies have, that people have, actually turn out to be central to the mission of whatever that organization is. Great companies hone in on these moments, these stories, and they tell them really well. Great, your best salespeople are great storytellers. They're just great because they know they're reading their audience. They know what the right words are to say. But I think the more, as time goes on, especially in the last few years, the cry for authentic and real is really important. It's really important.
Yeah, and I think for me, for folks that are maybe not the natural born charismatic, because I never was that person. But I think for me, when I got to a point where I could just make it personal, and I just started sharing my own personal stories and it just became natural to me to share. If I'm trying to dissect a really complicated problem, I will break it down myself and understand it in my own way. And then I will find some way to draw an analogy so other people can see the same thing. And I do that through my own personal stories, and a lot of times through humor and other things like that. Good examples, what Jamie and I were just published an episode this week on giving negative feedback. And we were talking about how different people have different mechanisms and styles for how they'll solve problems, just like toothpaste. And that's the analogy to me. When I think of what's essential versus what's non-essential, I think of arguing with my wife over how to squeeze toothpaste out of the, anyway. So I think helping people use their own personal story, I think is a good first step.
Stop right here, right now, because I listened to that episode. That little funny toothpaste back and forth between you came within the first about 3 minutes.
Yeah.
3 or 4 minutes. I paused the podcast. I ran out to my wife and I said, "You have to hear this." It was such a funny exchange, but actually made the point very clearly. That's a great story. And that story was about 17 seconds long. You got to go back. If you want to hear it, you got to go back and listen to the very beginning of the podcast. But that was just, people wouldn't call that storytelling, right? They would just call that, I don't know, a funny moment. Right. But there was actually a story you were telling that you built there about your marriage that was so hilarious and poignant and set the tone for the whole podcast. So that's a great example of something so simple. Now, my question is, were you cognizant of that? Did you,
stumble? No, that was one we just kind of stumbled on. I think to me, I was looking for a way to go draw an analogy to essential versus unessential things. And that was the first thing. I just picked the most crazy thing I could think about. And it just happened to be that Jamie and I were polar opposites on that, which worked out perfectly. But I think, I think if you're not a good storyteller, or if you want to get better at this, leveraging your own personal experience and leveraging your own personal story, which I love your point about, you need to be journaling this or typing them up or writing or just capturing a couple of notes when you're thinking about memories of your childhood or interesting things you've done in the past, capturing those, and then practicing telling people about those things. You'll find cases where you'll say, you know what, this problem reminds me of that story. Well, boom, there's your opportunity to bring that in. And it doesn't take a tremendous amount of time. And you're right. I think people wouldn't see that necessarily as a story per se, but it's a way to connect with your audience for them to be like, oh, I see what he's saying. The point is this. So it's just really just a communication kind of hack.
Find people who you're safe around, who you can bounce these stories off of, people who like to hear your voice. Share with them what you hope to accomplish by this story, then share the story, and then say to them, what do I need to cut out or what do I need to add to bring this story to where it needs to be to accomplish what I want to accomplish. Everyone, Brent, everyone is a good storyteller. Every single person. It's just they may be too afraid to tell their stories or maybe overconfident in their stories, but everyone has the ability to tell a good story. Everyone has the ability to use these in a way in their careers, in their businesses, that will massively enhance the way they communicate to those who are listening. And I think that's the point. It's, do you want to be a better communicator? Do you want to make things clear to people? Do you want people to remember? Because they will never remember just a list of facts. They just won't. They will always remember a great story, and even more so, they'll remember the feeling you brought to them when you told that great story. And that sticks with people long after they've left your organization or moved on or done other things. Those kind of stories, you'll bump into someone 20 years later and go, remember when you told that story about... That's the way it happens. When we, I remember bumping into an old friend of mine after I hadn't seen him in 35 years. We were like in just young teenagers the last time we were together. We went out for a meal, and all we did for 4 hours was tell the stories we remembered from when we were kids. And one of those stories inspired him so much that it was a story about a teddy bear, weird enough. He went back and kind of created a narrative around it and brought it to his staff as like an inspirational story to his staff as he was starting a new company. And he held up this teddy bear. I had sent it to him because I still had it at the end. And he said there was almost like an audible gasp in the room of him just pulling out this teddy bear. He said it was like it was, like it was gold or something. But it suddenly brought this story home, just kind of having that there. Just weird couple of friends sharing something that happened when, they were in 4th grade together. And he used it as an inspiration point for his company. Yeah.
Yeah, that should inspire all of us to think about the different stories that we have and capture them. Write them down. I really like that idea. I think that's something that I hope our listeners do, is start capturing that. You can use Keep Notes or Notepad or old school pen and paper, but start capturing some of those stories. Because and because for me, at least, as I write them, I have a better chance of remembering them. And as it comes up, jotting those down. And then I expect you will find opportunities and places to tie those in your day-to-day job. Because at the end of the day, the name of the game is connecting with your audience, right? And there's no better way to connect with your audience than through story, in my opinion. So capture your stories. I really like that, Shawn.
Jamie, we had not heard of this Moth Storytime podcast. And then after Shawn brought it up, you and I listened to an episode yesterday. And it was really entertaining.
It really was.
Yeah,
Because,
really...
I mean, you and I both love comedians,
Sure.
right? But this was just storytellers taking
Yeah.
the stage, telling a story from their childhood or their
Right.
upbringing or whatever. It was
Yeah.
fantastic.
And it just reminded me of, when Shawn talks about everybody can be a storyteller, you all have conflicts that have happened in your life. And I bet if you're sitting there thinking, yeah, but I don't have those kinds of stories, think about the different conflicts that you've had in your life at points where there was conflict, where you were trying to accomplish something. I bet there's some great stories in there. And listening to that podcast reminded me that these are just average people that were telling stories, but I was in love with it. I was like, that's a really great story. It doesn't take an incredible orator to tell a good story.
And if you don't have time to write this down right now, we'll have it all in the show notes. We'll have links to both of the books that Shawn recommended and to the Moth podcast.
Have a great week, folks.